Hello everyone and welcome back to Full Moon News. Well, sort of. As you can probably grasp by the title, I'd like to do something a bit different today and do my first Full Moon News op-ed, or basically an opinion piece. I might do these from time to time, but don't worry, I'm not ditching the original format entirely. Anyway, today I'd like to talk about violence and its relation to gaming. This has been an idea that's been in the back of my mind for a while, as far as writing something and making a video about it, but given the school shooting in Florida and the very predictable reaction of certain people, this has jumped to the forefront of my brain. So yeah, today I'll tell you what I think of this whole thing. And as a side note, this was delayed a good bit due to news coverage, various articles, and events that just kept happening one after another. As such, I kept editing my notes and having some extra thoughts. So yeah, that's partially why this video is as late as it is. Firstly, I guess I'll start with the words that kick this off. See, in the US, whenever a mass shooting happens, we like to try and blame something and say what could make it so it never happens again. Many people say, more gun regulation, or ban guns altogether. Another group will say, no, we need better mental health. And then we have our third group who will blame extraneous things for what happened. Movies, video games, etc., which is where we're heading now. Why this video is as late as it is. The first couple quotes that start this off I'm taking from a Felpa DeFranco video, and the first quote is from Florida Congressman Brian Moss.
What do we do with the biggest pusher of violence? The biggest pusher of violence is hands down Hollywood movies, hands down the video game market. When you look at Call of Duty, when you look at movies like John Wick, the societal impacts of people being desensitized to killing in ways that are different than how somebody that was on the battlefield is desensitized is troubling.
The biggest pusher of violence is movies and games. I can't agree to that at all. In my experience, and also from studies I've seen, people who are violent are usually raised to be as such. For example, people who are bullies and/or violent tend to be those who are excessively beaten by their parents or authority figures. Now, one could perhaps make the argument that media can affirm these tendencies, but I would go so far as to say that these things have to already be present in the individual. Otherwise, they wouldn't really have much effect on the person's mind. Now we move on to a quote from Matt Bevin, a governor from Kentucky.
And then you look at the culture of death that is being celebrated. There are video games that, yes, are listed for mature audiences, but kids play them and everybody knows it, and there's nothing to prevent a child from playing them.
Whoa, let's stop right there, shall we? Once again, another person is misinformed on how the sale of video games works. There are indeed things to stop the child from playing these so-called death-celebrating games. Firstly, if you go to a physical game store, an employee will not sell a minor an M-rated game, M being mature for 17+. It's required that a parent or guardian be present in order for a child to purchase a game in that category. While we're on that subject, since movies are involved in this a bit too, movies have a similar rule. You can't get a ticket to an R-rated movie as a minor unless you're accompanied by a parent or guardian. Now, if the employee messes up and does it anyway, that's one thing. But the policy of most companies is indeed to prevent children from getting their hands on such material. And while we're sort of on the subject of parents and guardians, they would be the other, and I would argue even bigger, factor in this discussion. I believe parents should take full responsibility for letting their kids have access to such things. As a parent, you're the frontline defense, as it were, for your child. This not only includes what outside factors do to them, but also what they do in the outside world. I plan to talk more about this in a bit, but yeah, moving on.
Celebrate the slaughtering of people. There are games that literally replicate and give people the ability to score points for doing the very same things that these students are doing inside of schools, where you get extra points for finishing someone off who's lying there begging for their life.
Well, games don't quite use point systems as much as they used to, and while I personally don't play a ton of shooter games, I'm not overly familiar with any games that reward you even more for killing someone begging for their life. I guess it does exist, but I'd like to ask this question. What about war movies? I know they say movies with graphic violence are also to blame for this, but are war movies included in that? I would personally argue that a war movie is more guilty of glorifying killing than most video games, especially older movies that seem to exist mostly for showing how great our soldiers are. Every time this country goes to war movies go on the rise, and they glorify violence and death a great deal. Yet I see no one protesting them. I personally believe this cognitive disconnect is because gaming hasn't been around as long as other media. There are plenty of books, movies, television shows, etc., that have glorified violence and other things that I might personally deem immoral. But yes, I believe that these are important questions to ask the people who say this. I doubt the politicians I show here will give a satisfying answer to them, and most probably won't even hear them, but I still can't help but wonder anyway.
These are quote-unquote video games, and they're forced down our throats under the guise of protected speech. It's garbage. It's the same as pornography.
That's just not true. Nothing is forced down your throat. The government or companies you work for don't give you a required gaming list or something. No, these games are marketed to you with commercials and such, like any other product out there in our capitalist system. Some more, some less, all dependent on who has the most money to spend on such a thing, and if they believe it's a worthwhile investment. And it's not under the guise of free speech, it is indeed free speech. Artistic expression is freedom of speech. Just because you don't like something or think it's immoral does not mean it doesn't deserve to exist. I really dislike this line of thinking and think it's very harmful. And lastly, for this section of politician quotes, we have the president himself saying just about the same things. Here you go.
We have to look at the internet because a lot of bad things are happening to young kids and young minds, and their minds are being formed. And we have to do something about maybe what they're seeing and how they're seeing it. And also video games. I'm hearing more and more people say the level of violence on video games is really shaping young people's thoughts. And then you go the further step, and that's the movies. You see these movies, they're so violent, and yet a kid is able to see the movie if sex isn't involved, but killing is involved. And maybe they have to put a rating system for that. And you get into a whole very complicated, very big deal. But the fact is that you are having movies come out that are so violent with the killing and everything else that maybe that's another thing we're going to have to discuss. And a lot of people are saying it. You have these movies today where you can go and have a child see the movie, and yet it's so violent and so disgusting. So we may have to talk about that also.
Wow. It's really hard to have a proper reaction to this. Though I do enjoy that the YouTube video I got this clip from has 400-something likes and over 2,000 dislikes at the time of writing this part of my script. Goes to show where the public is on this foolishness. I think I first want to point out that this statement has a good few instances of people say. It's one of the few times that I want to say citation needed, even though it's really cliche at this point. So what people? Your fellow politicians? I mean, who are we talking about here? I think that's a good thing to know, but of course it's not specified, which is typical. Lastly, I'd like to note that the things he says about movies is completely incorrect, as I've mentioned earlier. Now then, time for me to branch off into the more opinion piece part of this. And to do that, I'll be using one part of Trump's comments as a springboard. He talks about young people's minds being formed by media. You know what forms the minds of young people? Their parents. the people around them, the world around them, etc. That's what forms their minds. Yeah, I guess media can have an effect, but they'll have parental interaction much sooner than they can even understand any media they see or play. As such, I believe that, first and foremost, it is the job of parents to... Time for a little anecdote from Tsuki land. I've been playing video games since I was about 5 years old. Inevitably, I started playing the more violent games like Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter, etc. I also was around when my parents would watch violent movies. However, as time went on and I played these games and saw these movies, my mom eventually sat me down and said straight out, "These movies and games and TV shows are fiction. They're pretend. This is not how you solve problems in the real world." Granted, the thought of solving problems with violence never even really entered my mind, but I still think it was a good thing that my mom made sure that I knew the difference between reality and fiction, and also that I shouldn't go around trying to mimic what I saw. This type of thing is what I believe parents should do. On the other hand, I also believe that a person who cannot separate reality from fiction may have some more serious mental issues that a violent piece of media didn't cause. The point is, if people are so worried about the formation of young minds, that starts with the caregivers. Monitor their children and make notes of their behavior. I also believe that it's important for parents to tell their children the difference between fiction and reality. I will say, though, that I know parents can't solve every problem. It may be unpopular to say this, but I think some people are just born with, or have in early years, some serious mental issues. For example, let's say you have a person who is just naturally violent. This could be due to a chemical imbalance, excess hormones in both men and women, etc. The person who is predisposed toward violence is someone that I believe will gravitate towards a violent game and want to emulate it. They're predisposed after all, so they like the violence. Not just as catharsis, not just as a release of aggression, but they genuinely like the idea of being violent. I believe this is the person who is more likely to do a mass shooting or other violent act. Let's take for example those young girls who stabbed their friend. For those who don't know the story, there's an internet figure called Slender Man, who is used in a lot of horror stories. These, I think they were about 11 or 12. Anyway, these kids, these young girls, they loved Slender Man, and the state they lived in had a place that was rumored to be Slender Man's mansion. They decided that they would lure a friend of theirs, kill her, then show their work to Slender Man in his mansion so they could live with him. This is a prime example of a predisposition toward violence and just pure psychosis. These girls didn't play video games, and yet they did something so despicable. At least I'm guessing they didn't play video games. Most girls don't, really. And no one mentioned it, so again, I'm guessing they didn't. Anyway, the idea of games being a scapegoat for people's violent behavior is foolish. There are way too many things that contribute to someone's psychological makeup for us to just focus on one of them. I know this sort of sounds like the "we should focus on mental health" argument, and I admit in a way I suppose it is, but it's more than just that. It's more so that some people have mental health issues and we should be more cautious. However, we should also know that not everyone with mental health issues has violent tendencies. Basically, it's not a "we should focus on mental health" argument as much as it is a "we need more education about psychology and rehabilitation of those with psychological issues" argument. While I've been giving this issue some thought, I've also been searching for some statistics, and as I did so, something hit me. A good few other countries play these horribly violent games, and yet their mass shootings, they're not nearly as prevalent. This leads me to believe that it isn't so much the games themselves, but maybe a cultural issue instead. One could say, well, there's a gun culture in certain states, but I'm not sure it's quite that. From what I've seen of people who are in that culture, they have an emphasis on being a more responsible gun owner and gun safety above all else. However, I will also say that they're very close-minded to any gun regulation whenever it comes up. Of course, I'm not saying all gun owners or all people who grew up in a gun culture or anything like that. This is just what I've personally observed. This is an op-ed after all. I'm open to the idea that I'm totally wrong, and maybe at least half of the people in that particular subset are into more gun regulation. I know, for instance, that most Americans favor background checks before being able to buy a gun of any kind. But still, I can't help but wonder what exactly makes it so that tons of other countries can play these games, yet we're the only ones that seem to have this huge mass shooting issue. One part is that a lot of countries either have a very strict gun regulation or outlaw guns altogether, so I imagine that's part of it. But still, if someone is violent and determined enough, they'll get a gun. So, what exactly is the deal? I can't say I know, but I'd love to hear others' thoughts on the subject. So, you remember how I said that I delayed this video because people kept saying stuff and things kept happening? Well, one of those things is that the White House put out a video that showed a bunch of violent video game scenes with no context whatsoever. Not only that, but during the meeting Trump had with people in the gaming industry as well as some outsiders, this video was apparently shown. And while I acknowledge that these scenes are indeed violent, this whole thing is totally disingenuous. Not only are no scenes given context, but it also seems to me like they're saying, this is all video games. He even said, according to this article, this is violent, isn't it? Dude, way to totally miss the point. I don't think anyone is disputing that video games are violent. However, what I and others are disputing is the idea that this causes any kind of psychosis one would need to become a mass murderer. And fine, I'll concede that some games are violent and some children shouldn't be seeing them. Just because I wasn't violent and I was able to easily differentiate fiction from reality at a young age doesn't mean all children have that ability. As such, the ESRB, the rating system for video games in the USA, was created. The games are rated by content, not sold to minors if they're rated M, or adults only. And the rating information gives you details on why the game is rated that way. Not only that, but we live in the internet age now. Researching what a game has in it is extremely easy. But I have a much bigger problem with this huge overgeneralization that all video games are violent. I play a lot of video games, as I said before. I've been playing them since the age of 5, and I haven't stopped. I've always had some form of gaming in my life, and during my 27 years of being a gamer, I've played many different games of many different genres. To be honest, most of the games I've played, or that I play regularly, have had more of the fantasy violence label. RPGs like Final Fantasy, some of the Atelier games, Chrono Trigger, Chrono Cross, etc. Most certainly, they don't have this realistic violence, such as Call of Duty, etc. Besides that, though, I've also played games like Flower, Journey, The Sims. I wouldn't consider those violent at all. Well, okay, maybe The Sims can be violent in a way if you want to be a sadistic god player of sorts, but not really. Can games be violent? Of course they can. But just ending the discussion there does no one any good. Games are like any other art form. Yeah, violence exists in it, but so do amazing characters, breathtaking worlds, stories that bring out all sorts of emotions. And even in those violent games, most of these people are missing the point. Gamers don't think of this as, I'm killing people. It's often a way to relieve stress and also has the same properties as a sport. We think of strategies in order to take on our opponents, be they AI or real person. Yes, people get competitive and sometimes aggression comes out, but that's not always a bad thing. Bottling up anger is unhealthy, after all. Being able to vent it through competitive gaming or just going crazy in a virtual world is far more healthy than taking it out on actual human beings. So yeah, that's my big op-ed. I wish I had a great solution to stop the mass shooting problem. However, the sad truth is that people have been killing each other pretty much since the dawn of humanity itself. That alone goes to show that media isn't the be-all, end-all as far as people's psychology. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this, or it made you think, or something positive. I'm really sorry this took as long for me to make as it did. As I said before, people kept saying things and stuff kept happening, etc. I've also had a lot of real life things just pile up one after the other in the past few weeks, and I just couldn't work on content like I wanted to. Oh, and the old full moon news format isn't going away, but I am thinking of mixing it up with both the old format and these op-eds every now and then. So let me know what you all think, and if you have any ideas or other feedback, feel free to comment here or contact me via social media. And finally, if you're feeling generous, there are donation links in the video description. Thanks to any of you who continue to support my work, and also thanks to anyone who watched this entire video. I'm extremely grateful, believe me. Take care, till we meet again.